It's Matthew self-paced Bible study. So this is week 11. So just like a Bible study, we go through week by week, and self-paced Bible study, hence the, times and sections and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to break this up so that you could go through a weekly Bible study. And, if you went to a Bible study, it'd take you about an hour. So I wanted you to have some extra time left over to be able to jot down some notes or think about what you're going through. But week 11, chapters 26 through 28. So this is the end of Matthew. These are the last 3 chapters in Matthew. And so obviously it's going to have Jesus' crucifixion, as well as, the idea of him being condemned and forsaken, his crucifixion, his resurrection, rebuilding, and his last words to the disciples. So a lot going on there. This is section 1. So we're going to be talking about Jesus getting prepared for his crucifixion. And then we're going to talk about the level of forsakenness that Jesus faces on the cross, and the idea of the baptism and the Lord's Supper, which, when you think about it, are actually incredibly violent rituals. And so we're going to jump into that and what those actually mean. But with that, let's jump into it. In the beginning of chapter 26, Jesus tells of his death a 4th time. And so he's told of his death before. What other details does Jesus foreshadow about the upcoming events here? He's going to be killed. He's going to be crucified. That Judas will betray him and that Peter will deny him. So he's actually going into a lot more detail, saying that he's going to be crucified, that Judas is going to be the betrayer, or that he's going to be betrayed, right? And that Peter is going to deny him. The Passover is Jesus' last meal. What are some of the symbols and meanings behind that Passover that give us hints at the significance of the death of Christ? It's the death of Christ, and it's happening during the Passover festival. During Passover, a lamb without blemish is slaughtered. The intent of slaughtering the lamb was so that death would pass over the house. So there's an idea of a pure sacrifice needing to be made for an atonement. In Egypt, the Israelites faced death of their firstborn. But we all face the wages of sin in our lives, which is death. So to escape this bondage of sin, there's a necessary sacrifice that has to be made. Just like the lamb had to be sacrificed so that the firstborn didn't die, Jesus is being sacrificed so that we don't have to face death. The crucifixion account is often shown and used by scholars, academics, and atheists to show that the narratives don't really match up, and so there's inconsistency. And I've heard this over and over again, but when you look at the Gospels, I think it's pretty clear that each author is pointing out one aspect of Jesus' crucifixion that isn't the same from gospel to gospel. They kind of put a focus on a specific aspect of it, or they talk about certain particulars in a specific way. When we remember that Matthew's gospel is that he's a Jew writing to a Jewish audience, I think it's very important to understand that the different perspectives that people are taking and what the outcome of the way that they present the narrative has on their audience. They're all narrative stories, eyewitness accounts of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And so when you take that into account, yes, there's going to be some ways in which they're different, but they all fit together very seamlessly. Matthew's gospel being a Jewish gospel, I think that he really focuses on the Jewish rejection of the Messiah. This idea of Jesus going to the cross and being totally forsaken by his own followers, betrayed and denied by his own followers, by his society and his culture, by being called a blasphemer and them calling for the death penalty. And then, in addition to that, even forsaken by God on the cross, when he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Like in Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like this idea of abandonment and forsakenness is on full display in Matthew's gospel, leaving us with this image of Jesus being left utterly and completely alone. So there are many illustrations of human weakness and sinfulness in the last events leading up to the crucifixion. And just to recap some of those, Judas betrays him. Jesus is betrayed and handed over with a kiss. Judas literally kisses him on the cheek as betrayal, right? Like his own follower kisses him on the cheek as a way to show him who Jesus is so he can be arrested. It's interesting to point out here as well that Judas is never recorded calling Jesus Christ or Lord. Instead, he calls him Rabbi. That's interesting because a lot of progressive Christians right now say that he's a wise man, a nice teacher from the Middle East, and that's nothing new. It was kind of a funny thing when I read that. So in addition to Judas betraying, Peter denies him, not once or twice, but 3 times. And that's like a sign of completeness in Jewish narratives. This 3 times would emphasize the point that it was a pretty adamant betrayal, pretty intentional thing that's happening. Further evidence that Jesus is left alone. When he goes to the garden, the disciples can't even stay awake in the garden to pray with him. He comes and kicks them awake. So Jesus has been saying that this is coming now, that we're going to go to the garden and pray, to stay vigilant, to stay alert. Right after this Passover meal where he talks about being betrayed, his disciples can't even hold it together for a little while Jesus prays. It's also interesting because the same men who then become apostles, right? They're the disciples and apostles of Christ, and these people who build the church and have such bravery and steadfastness and commitment later on. Right here we see them failing at their job. Like you have one job and they're utterly failing. So we see the same men who built the church here, they have so much bravery, they become apostles, they build the church community, they go out and are persecuted, many of them are martyred, and they face it with courage and faith in God, and yet here they can't even stay awake. I think it points to the impact of Jesus talking about bringing the helper. All of that happens in Acts after the Holy Spirit comes and sits on the apostles and followers of Christ. I mean, think about that difference between here, where they run away, they're scattered, they deny Jesus, they completely and utterly fail. What transforms them? What's the major difference? They didn't do that just with Jesus. And I think that's an important thing. We put our faith in Jesus, right? But there is an element of us partaking in the Holy Spirit that allows us to do what we need to do, that empowers us and strengthens us to fulfill our God-given destinies, right? To step into that and to act faithfully. So it's kind of actually encouraging to me that the disciples fail so utterly and completely here, and then later on are able to do great things for God. Either way you slice it, though, in Jesus' last moments, the disciples fall asleep and they fail him. What stands out to you as Jesus is praying in Gethsemane? What are some of the words or phrases as he's praying that really stand out to you? What do you think he was feeling or going through? And why do you think the image of the cup here is so important? Why does he say that? If this cup should pass before me, or pass away from me, but not my will, but yours, right? He's obviously sorrowful and troubled, and he knows what's coming in great detail, and he's still giving himself to God. I think it's interesting that they uses the imagery of the cup, because a cup of wrath is a cup that we drink from and overflows. That it's like this idea that we drink and drink and drink, and God keeps filling it up because we're asking for it. We keep drinking it, and so God keeps filling it up. Often we get this idea that we're a victim, right? But God isn't taking this cup and pouring it down our throats. We simply, he keeps filling it as we drink from the cup of wrath. There are often times we dig ourselves into all kinds of sinful situations, and we don't want to face the judgment of our actions in life, but ultimately we end up having to. When we take sinful actions, there are consequences of those. And sometimes we live with the consequences, and others we don't. And sometimes we're guilty or ashamed. We feel guilty or ashamed about something, and other times we don't. But this idea of sin being poured down our throat, I think it's inaccurate. I think that's why it's such a powerful symbol of being a cup of wrath, where people willingly drink this sinful brew, this sinful concoction in the cup of wrath. We willingly keep drinking God's wrath as we continue to sin. Again, Jesus is willingly doing this. Jesus is willingly drinking from the cup so that we can accept God's grace and faith. That's why he's being crucified, is to give us hope. So that leads us right into our theological discussion for this section of the week. But before I do that, please hit like. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd love for you to catch all these videos, and I'm going to have I'm looking to do a complete Bible cover-to-cover Bible study series, all the books in the Bible, as well as put out a reading plan for a 180-day Bible reading plan so that we can stay on track, read the Bible twice in a year, and just keep digging deeper into the Bible each time. I'm also going to try to give prayer recommendations and point out different thoughts to have while you're doing these studies. They're not like those candy-coated study thoughts that you get from like YouVersion, things like that, but intended to help you start thinking about, just kind of jumping off points so you can dig deeper and really think these concepts through on your own, as well as maybe get some hints into some deeper theological concepts that you can use to grow, to guide your family, to make sure that you're staying faithful to God, all those different things that are really important, but also to help fill you up with hope and love and patience and get rid of anger and bitterness and really step into a biblical role for yourself and to take those gifts that God's given you and do your best with them. So that's the intent of the channel. I hope we're doing that a little bit, but subscribe. It's the easiest way for you to get all that content as it comes out. So I love it. So our very first theological concept here is forsaken, Jesus being completely forsaken so that we can be accepted by God. Jesus oversees the Passover meal and gives the disciples a new covenant. I didn't think about this until I heard somebody talking about the Passover and what it means to the Jewish community. It's a very emotional, it's a very spiritual time, and it's a holiday time. It's like the biggest festival. So I want to set the stage here a little bit. Imagine that it's Christmas time. And Christmas Eve is there. Christmas Eve comes and you have all your friends, your closest friends and relatives around you. And you're pulling pies out of the oven and there's cookies everywhere and those little cheese balls and all different kinds of crackers and charcuterie. And it's just like a party, right? And all of a sudden, just imagine that your best friend then comes up to you and says that he's dying. And that he knows he's going to die the next day. Just imagine how you'd feel, like the no way, man, and like that can't be right feeling. You're smelling the spicy air fresheners and all the pies and the food, and everybody's laughing and having a good time around you. And then he hits you with this. And then take it a step further and imagine that this person is leading lots of other people. They're in a big position of authority. They've been healing other people. They've been taking care of everybody else for years. They're just one of the greatest people. They're the greatest person that you've ever known. And you've been firsthand eyewitness to this for years. Imagine that they've raised people from the dead and prophesied, right? And the disciples didn't have to imagine this. This is Jesus. And then imagine that after the party, your friend comes up to you and says, "Hey, will you pray with me for a little bit?" And you say, "Sure." And then a little while later, your friend wakes you up. You fell asleep. You couldn't even be there for your friend. And then imagine people coming to take him. And that this person that you've been with for years, they come and they're going to arrest him. The cops show up and not only do you not do anything about it, but you flee. The one person that does something about it, he tells them to stop. You feel completely powerless, right? And you are completely powerless. And you actually run away from the scene. You actually leave. You can't even stand there and watch what's happening. Then imagine you find out it was one of your best friends that betrayed him, that led to this whole series of events. The next step is that he's not even... you've seen all the miracles, you've seen all this. They're charging him with blasphemy, and they're saying that they're going to kill him. And then he's actually, it's not good enough just to kill him. They're going to torture him. And so you see that he's being tortured and tortured and tortured before the slowest, most painful death they can imagine for him. At that moment, with all of those different factors, Jesus was completely and utterly forsaken. And he took all that upon himself, and you know he took all that upon himself, just so that you could approach God's throne, just so that you could even have a chance. It's not even guaranteed. Some people are going to be judged, some people are going to go to hell, some people are going to choose hell. But he did it so you'd have a chance. So that there's a chance you can be seen blameless in front of God, completely and utterly forsaken, for you to be accepted by God. And with all that violent symbols and imagery, that leads us into baptism and the Lord's Supper as a theological concept. Baptism is a violent event. It's a symbol of a couple different things in the Bible, and when you tie them together, they're not peaceful, wonderful symbols, really. I mean, they were wonderful for some people, but they're about utter destruction. The flood, the Red Sea, these are symbols of water coming and destroying impurity. When we're baptized, it's a symbol of being washed in Jesus' blood, whether it's the Baptist way of total immersion, like we're being just submerged into water and brought up, being put down into death and raised into new life, or whether it's the sprinkling of Jesus' blood as of a sacrifice like the Presbyterians or some other groups do, where they do the sprinkling. We're being washed with Jesus' blood. That's what allows us to leave our former self behind and step into life that Jesus is offering us. And speaking of Jesus, the Lord's Supper is super weird when you think about it. It's literally ingesting, it's a symbol of ingesting Jesus' body and drinking his blood so that he can be a part of us. It's a symbol of us stepping into Christ's body, of being one with Christ. Just think about that for a second. I mean, it's kind of weird. It's this idea that we're eating Christ's body, drinking his blood so that we can be one with him. And these events are to show our unity to Christ in action and substance, right? That we do physically become one body, Christ's body. It's to symbolize that we leave one life behind and we step into a cleansed new life. Both of those rituals symbolize something pretty violent and pretty shocking, even to us today. Even though I've been around it my whole life, it's still, when I think about it that way, it is a little bit hard to think about. But ultimately, that's where our hope comes from. Our hope comes from a new life in Christ, joining with Christ's body in the kingdom of heaven, and storming the gates of hell, where ultimately, when that day of judgment happens, when God sets everything right, that is the moment that we'll be reconciled to God, which all happens because Jesus went through this horrendous, terrible death on a cross. And that's the gospel. So that's all I have for you this week. I will catch you in the next video. But until then, peace.